On the morning of May 13th, U-557 was finally ready to sail. As a last ritual, we brought aboard our clothing and a few personal belongings, writing materials, books, a toothbrush, snapshots of the family and of one or more girls. Shaving implements were prohibited. Our beards would have to grow because the boat's limited supply of fresh water was to be used only for cooking and drinking. Lieutenant Siebold, in charge of stowing procedures, kept a watchful eye on our comings and goings. His frequent checks turned up a few forbidden bottles of liquor, an excess of clothing or cigarettes. He eventually achieved a proper balance between supply and demand. At 11 o'clock, the boat's company assembled in the liner for an extraordinary farewell dinner. The staff of the 5th U-boat flotilla turned out to wish us Godspeed. We were suddenly important, the centre of attraction. After a Lucullian lunch, the flotilla's commandant toasted captain and crew and expressed his best wishes for a successful mission. Then he added, "Since one among you has his birthday today, this makes the 13th of May a good day to sail. Let it be a sign of luck which shall prevail throughout your patrol. Happy birthday to Ensign Werner." The surprise was on me. I suspected that the leak came from Siebold, who knew my vital statistics. Our spirits were high as we emptied our last glass of champagne and as we poured out of the steamer onto the pier. A navy band was playing a resounding march, and a large crowd gathered. The moment we crossed the narrow gangplank onto U-557, we were caught up in shipboard routine. A last head count, a few commands, and the ropes were removed from the pillars. U-557 slid away in reverse, silently. Very slowly she separated from the pier, cleared her submerged hydroplanes, then increased speed. 50 metres off the pier, the exec swung the boat around and ordered the diesels started. A strong vibration travelled through the hull, and for a moment dark fumes escaped the exhausts. The twin screws beneath the stern thrashed the water into a foamy whirlpool. Both engines half ahead together, steer 9-5. U-557 turned sharply to starboard and thrust forward toward the centre of the bay. The music faded. The crowd lining the waterfront dispersed. 1 hour later, we manoeuvred through the locks of Holtenau into the Northeast Sea Canal. For the rest of the day and the following night, we sailed at reduced speed through the narrow waterway. At dawn the next morning, we reached its western end, the locks to the Elbe River at Brunsbüttel, where 2 other U-boats had been waiting for our arrival. At 10 o'clock, a pack of 3 wolves headed for the open sea. The low shore soon faded to a very thin line, then it sunk below the smudgy horizon. The pack sailed in line, with U-557 up front. I was on watch until noon. As part of my regular duties throughout this mission, I mounted the bridge at 8 o'clock and at 20 o'clock for 4-hour stints under Obersteuermann, Warrant Officer Wiesner, our navigator and 3rd watch officer. After a quick lunch, I returned to the bridge to help keep a lookout for drifting mines. Before long, the island of Helgoland appeared on port side. A rain squall came down like a curtain, however, and blotted out the view. The pack made good headway. To the east, beyond the horizon, was Denmark and the continent. To the west, only a few miles away, huge minefields loomed just below surface. After sundown, I mounted the bridge again for my regular watch. The 4 of us on duty scanned the sky for enemy planes, searched the waters for drifting mines. Dusk came slowly, gradually turning the sea darker and darker. I had plenty of time to make my peace with God. At midnight, Gerloff relieved me from watch. I fell through the hatch and lowered myself into the black hull. The conning tower was illuminated only by a feeble shimmer from the phosphorescent face of the compass. The control room was dimmed. I could barely make out the round of the hull, the dials, wheels, switches, valves, and equipment. A small lamp, well shaded, distributed a soft light over the chart table. With the boat listing and swaying beneath me, I staggered into the chief petty officer's small wardroom, where I had a tiny locker and a narrow upper bunk. I jackknifed up into the tight berth, closed the aluminum guardrail, and wedged myself between closet and wall. For long hours I was kept awake by the diesel's rhythmical knocking and the splashing of water against steel, and by my thoughts of sailing against the enemy. Around 6 o'clock I became aware that the boat was rocking vigorously. We had left the German bay and entered the Skagerrak. At 8 o'clock I mounted my watch, packed in heavy oil clothes. The sea had gone mad. Sheets of foam and spray slashed across the bridge. When hard breakers crashed against the conning tower, the boat shuddered violently. The 2 companion boats had been lost during the night. U-557 was alone in the vastness of the turbulent water desert. We on the bridge were silently scanning the sea, the horizon, the sky. When U-557 stood due east of the Shetland Islands, ploughing her way through heaving mountains of water and foam, we changed course to west-northwest toward the Atlantic. Then at 23 o'clock, the captain ordered another course change due west. We had reached a point about 70 miles north of the Shetland Islands. Here we would break through the British air and sea blockade. U-557, her diesels throbbing reliably, made 14 knots through a lashing sea. The moon occasionally appeared from behind the flying clouds. The 4 of us on watch squeezed behind the superstructure, but cascades of water periodically turned the bridge into an icy pool. The towel that I had wrapped around my neck was soaked with water, which ran down my back and chest. As I stood there with the binoculars up to my eyes, water sloshed into my sleeves and coursed down into my boots. Suddenly the third mate said, "Shadow bearing 300, looks like freighter." I snapped around, pointed my glasses into the given direction. 6,000 or 7,000 meters ahead, a faint shadow was about to cross our path at an obtuse angle. The ship was heading west-northwest. "Captain to the bridge," Wiesner called into the tower with a controlled voice. The summons was repeated twice in the hull. Moments later, the captain emerged from the hatch. Wiesner pointed out the target. Paulson, adjusting his eyes to the darkness, spotted the vessel and said, "I'll take over, go down and plot the attack." Then he shouted into the hull, "On battle stations, right full rudder, steer 3-2, both engines full ahead together." The hunt was on. Paulson focused on the shadowy ship. The 3 of us scanned intensively to all sides. The exec reached the platform and fastened the strong night binoculars atop the target bearing transmitter, TBT. 2 seamen on the bridge were exchanged. The second seaman's mate adjusted his computer in the tower. The torpedo gang rushed to the tubes. The crew was on battle stations. Meanwhile, the freighter had veered to port, showing us her stern. We were now at a disadvantage. Paulson turned into the wind, which brought waves crashing against the tower from dead ahead. Then a black cloud blotted out the moon. For a long minute we almost lost our target. But when the moon reappeared, there was our prey, running westward under full power. Paulson, displeased with the progress of the chase, shouted through the voice tube to the radio room. "Tune in on 600-meter wavelength and monitor international traffic. If we've been detected, her skipper may stir up the neighborhood calling for help." As he gave his order, the target turned to starboard, settling on her previous course. The exec took fresh bearings, relayed his findings into the conning tower. "What's the target's speed and course?" After a moment, Wiesner's voice came from below. "Target speed 14 knots, course 260. The vessel was a fast new cargo ship trying to make it across the Atlantic as a loner. But during the first 70 minutes of our chase, we had reduced the gap distinctly, and it seemed certain that she was never going to reach the shore. The chase went on. Hunting fever had taken possession of us. We could not feel the waves slapping our faces, nor the water streaming down our skin. Ahead lay our first target, nothing else counted. Keeping in sight of the doomed vessel, but invisible to her with only the tip of the conning tower above water, we raced on a calculated path into the night. On 2 o'clock we had the target on port, bearing 270 degrees, and we ploughed forward relentlessly with ringing diesels into attack position. By 3 o'clock, when Paulson corrected course slightly, we had managed to gain bearing ahead of the shadow and remain unseen. The freighter's radio had been silent. She had changed course at regular intervals, almost guaranteeing the success of our attack. At 3:30, the captain told the exec to prepare for the shot. Kern moved behind his TBT, trained it on the enemy, and yelled into the tower above the racket of the diesels. Tubes 1 to 4 ready for surface attack. Open tube doors. Target angle left 50, speed 14, range 1000, torpedo depth 7. Stand by. Tubes 1 to 4 ready for firing, came the report from below. The next move had to come from the vessel. It would be her last if our calculations were correct. They were. The freighter made her turn exactly to the minute, swinging her bow toward us and racing straight into the trap Paulson had set for her. The captain threw his boat around into attack position, exposing the smallest silhouette to the enemy. The ship bore down on us like a monster out of the darkness, closing to 1,000 meters. "Shoot, exec!" Paulson shouted. Kern aimed once more, then barked, "Tube 1, fire! Tube 2, fire!" He simultaneously activated the lever at the TBT, permitting the release of the torpedoes. With 2 distinct shocks, 2 torpedoes shot out of our hull and churned toward the vessel. We focused our glasses at the shadowy mass of steel, which grew bigger by the second. Someone counted, 35, 36, 37. Suddenly, a huge fire column rose from the freighter. The hard crash of the explosion hit our ears a moment later. This was the death of a ship. Seibold's excited voice came through the tube. "Report from radio room. Vessel broadcasts as follows. German submarine torpedoed sinking 59 north." Message was not completed. Almost at once, the freighter listed to port. I saw her crew lower a few lifeboats. Other boats dangled absurdly askew in the davits. The great broken hull stood out black against the red, yellow, and golden flames. It was gruesomely beautiful. Paulson turned U-557 away from the sinking mass of debris. Tube doors were closed and the men secured from battle stations. The mortally wounded ship slipped away and gently sank deeper. Then, convulsively, her bow tilted upward and she plunged, stern first, beneath the surface. Nothing was left but life rafts tossed by high waves. Our first kill had come at 4 o'clock on May 19th. This swift victory, won in an area that most U-boats tried to avoid, was an extraordinary feat and gave us at least 7,000 tons to our credit. The pressure which had been building up for days was released. U-557 proceeded on her new course at maximum speed. The captain put as much distance as possible between us and the scene of the sinking, on the correct assumption that there would soon be a concentration of enemy power in the area. I was drenched and shivering after 9 hours on the bridge. The water in my boots spilled over at every move as I hurried down the aluminum ladder. Peeling off my sopping wet fatigues and underwear, I hung them up to dry in the aft torpedo room, then ran through the boat in the nude and crawled into my narrow bunk. For several days, U-557 proceeded on surface, both engines half ahead. The wind was rough and the sea mountainous. The motion of the boat was a perpetual swinging, swaying, rocking, rolling, and listing. Inside, the humidity was intolerable. Moisture condensing on the cold steel hull ran in streaks into the bilges. Food turned rotten and had to be thrown overboard. Bread became soggy and mildewy. Paper dissolved. Our clothes were clammy and never dried, and whatever we touched was wet and slimy. For days we had no proper navigational fix. We could not shoot a single star, nor did we see the sun or the moon. Only the daily trim dive brought relief from rocking and spray. Down in the quiet depth, we finished the work we otherwise could not perform, had a meal without losing it on the deck plates or in the bilges, and for an hour or two we recuperated while waiting for the next assault of water and wind. These routine dives were never long enough, and surfacing always came too soon. During those days of fighting the weather, we received from headquarters a radio message of greatest significance. Our largest capital ship, the battleship Bismarck, was reported to be on a hit-and-destroy mission in the North Atlantic, accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen. On May 24th, all U-boats at sea were informed of Bismarck's quick victory over the British dreadnought Hood, His Majesty's mightiest ship. U-boats were advised to stand by for orders relative to Bismarck's future operation. We considered the sudden appearance of these German surface vessels in the Atlantic a major achievement. The North Atlantic had become our front yard, and sailing there would be deadly for the British home fleet, as well as Allied merchantmen. Our conviction was strengthened by radio messages we intercepted from other U-boats. U-556 had sunk vessels totaling more than 30,000 tons on her latest mission. U-203 and U-93 and others had destroyed almost 100,000 tons of Allied shipping the previous weeks. On May 25th, between sundown and dusk, we of the Third Watch saw smudge darkening a large section of clouds on the westerly horizon. A few minutes later, we realized that the smudge was smoke rising from many stacks. Then we spotted the heads of countless masts. We were on Colossal course with a convoy. Wiesner reacted promptly, calling, "Captain to the bridge!" Paulson arrived, sighted, and issued a string of commands. The alarm shrieked. We jumped into the hatch, U-557 cut into the waves, and within 20 seconds she had submerged. As the boat balanced out, the crew hustled on to battle stations. "To periscope depth," the captain demanded. U-557 glided up to the designated elevation. The exec climbed into the tower. I assumed the helm. The humming noise of the periscope motor filled the small room. Paulson had difficulty with the scope and worked it up and down between the rise and fall of the rough seas. The operator on the sound gear reported that the convoy was approaching fast. Soon we heard the grinding of a multitude of screws with the naked ear. The sound man then detected an escort group ahead of the convoy. The throbbing noise of turning screws covered the entire westerly horizon. Then we heard the sharp metallic ping-ping of the Aztec impulses that the destroyers sent out to track us down. It was a new sensation for most of us on board. Each high-pitched sound struck the boat like a hammer hitting a tuning fork. Then it travelled through the hull, escaped and spread across the entire horizon. Meanwhile, the low thumping knock of many piston engines and the chirping song of turbines grew steadily louder and more distant. The soundman reported that the convoy had turned in a southerly direction. Suddenly, we distinguished the fast-rotating propeller of a destroyer. The captain, turning the scope quickly around its axis, called, "3 destroyers, bearing 320, distance 3,000 meters. Rudder full left, new course due south." We could have attacked the menacing destroyers, but Paulson wisely chose bigger, safer game. Soon he cried exultantly, "What a view! All 5 tubes ready for firing. Target speed 10, angle left 30, depth 7, range 1200. Hey, exec, take a look at the parade." Kern bent forward and pressed his forehead against the rubber cushion of the eyepiece. Then he gasped, "There are at least 30 of them, rocking like elephants." The captain resumed his circular sweep, but before long he gave a start and retracted the scope. "Both full ahead," he shouted. "Dive fast, Chief, bring her down." The screws rotated wildly, the boat vibrated strongly and plunged toward the ocean floor. "Prepare for depth charges. Level off at 170. The nerve-wracking swish-swish of an approaching escort grew louder, drowning out the groaning noise of the 30-odd cargo ships. The destroyer crossed our track astern, then hurried away into a northeasterly direction. Fader gradually brought U-557 up again to periscope depth, a manoeuvre that took almost 20 minutes. Meanwhile, the convoy had zigzagged again, and a quick sweep with the scope told Paulson that he was in a disadvantageous position, too far north for a perfect shot. At 21 o'clock, with nightfall only 45 minutes away, Paulson decided to wait until dark, then surface and seize the convoy from astern. In the conning tower, oil clothes were handed out to the assault watch, whose members made ready to mount the bridge. As part of the watch, I was relieved of the helm. 30 minutes passed in silence, with the captain still hunched over the scope. Then the soundman reported that the convoy had again changed course. The noise of many piston engines and throbbing propellers, magnified by the clear ocean water, made our hearts pulsate faster. At 22 o'clock, Paulson jumped off his seat and commanded, "Blow all tanks." As U-557 broke surface, Paulson flipped the lever of the hatch. It opened, and the howling wind swept spray into our faces. 5 of us followed the captain onto the bridge. The night was moonless and black perfect for the attack. The boat lay low, her deck awash. U-557 gained speed and surged after the targets. "Shadows bearing 25, distance 5,000, a lookout reported. Shadows bearing 350, called another. We had the convoy dead ahead and gradually closed the gap. Cleverly, Paulson had the boat slip in 300 meters astern of a freighter. Incredibly, there were no escorts. They were searching in the wrong direction. The wolf was in the middle of the flock. "Both engines 1/3 ahead," shouted Paulson. Then to the exec, "I am going to steer between the two columns. Take one shot for one ship. Take the farthest and fattest target first, the nearest last. Shoot to both sides and hold dead center." Our distance from the shadowy monsters ranged from 400 to 700 meters. It was a stunning situation, sailing undetected amid an armada of enemy ships, selecting at leisure the ones which had to die. The exec repeatedly assured himself that all target values were correct. Angle right 70, distance 500, speed 11 knots. The captain shouted into the wind, "Fire, exec, let them have it." The exec yelled above the roaring of the sea, "Tube 1, ready fire. Tube 2, ready fire." Then he looked to the port side and gave the firing command to tubes 3, 4, and 5. Time was 23:40. 5 torpedoes sliced toward the swaying phantoms. We waited tensely, unable to change course until the first torpedo struck home. The first explosion came on starboard. Another hit on port, then another. A new flash, and the savage salvo of detonations rocked the air. Red and yellow flames and a lava of molten steel were hurled into the air. We heard the hollow boom of collapsing bulkheads and the piercing shriek of falling masts. Hell reached a climax. Our faces glowed in the glare of the wildfire. The convoy fired a dozen flares which surged skyward in huge sweeps. One of the stricken vessels, a 7,000-ton cargo ship, rolled over to her side, extinguishing her flames in the floods. Keel up, she lifted her stern in her death agony, displayed rudder and screw in the flickering light, and slipped under fast. The second vessel broke amidships, collapsed like a pair of scissors. With a bellowing explosion, she sank. As the third freighter floated in flames out of her column, an explosion ripped off her bridge and sent a new fiery streak skyward. Huge chunks of steel and debris splashed into the water around us. We took cover behind the superstructure and waited until the rain of steel stopped. It was the vessel's last agonizing motion. She went down in less than a minute. A few burning planks were all that remained of 3 of Britain's ships. The toll would have been heavier if the convoy had not made a drastic turn to the northeast after our first torpedo struck. Because of this change of course, 2 of our torpedoes had missed. In the aftermath of the attack, I stood leaning against the periscope housing, scanning the seas astern. 2 escorts rocked along some distance behind us, their lookouts unable to spot our low silhouette in the heaving sea. Paulson manoeuvred us toward the convoy. U-557 fell in again a safe distance behind the last shadowy vessels and followed in their wake. Kern left the bridge to supervise the recharging of the tubes. Siebold transmitted a radio message telling Admiral U-boats of our contact. We on the bridge kept up our watch on the zigzagging convoy and made ready to renew our attack. At 2:30, the exec reported all tubes reloaded. The captain closed in on the freighters with the idea of repeating our successful penetration. We began our second assault with both engines at highest revolutions. There was no escort in the immediate vicinity. In any event, we were too close to the convoy for destroyers to operate safely. Siebold appeared in the hatch. He shouted to make himself heard above the storm. "Sir, radio message from headquarters. Do not attack further. Transmit beacon signals. Keep contact until new orders." Paulson cursed through his teeth. The order forced us to play a waiting game until our beacons had brought other U-boats to share our prey. Angrily, he ordered our speed reduced. U-557 fell back to the end of the columns, then headed north-northeast, using the dark horizon as cover for our escape. But as I routinely scanned the seas ahead, I saw a shocking sight. To our port, just 1,000 meters away, a destroyer was bearing down on us fast, her bow raising a white moustache of waves. 2 other escorts followed at a short distance. For a moment my tongue was glued to the roof of my mouth. Finally I shouted, "Destroyer, bearing 340, angle 0. Paulson reacted at once. "Right full rudder, both 3 times full ahead." U-557 swayed and listed while swerving in a bold arc. Then she ran away westward at maximum speed, straight into the onslaught of the waves. The three attackers, now astern, rocked strongly in the foamy sea, their bows dipping deep into the waves, their keels showing as they rode high up the crests. But despite their wallowing, they were closing the gap. I kept staring at them as if I alone had the power to hold them at bay. If we could only speed up by 1 or 2 more knots, we eventually would be able to outdistance them. The diesels hammered loudly, the boat vibrated strongly, but as I realized with a sudden chill, they were still gaining. Alarm! The captain's cry cut into the night. We plummeted down the hatch, through the tower, and onto the deck plates. Paulson shouted above the commotion, "Go down to 170 meters, down into the cellar fast." As the chief bellowed into his microphone, the captain reversed our course. We swung toward the destroyers, even as they rushed toward the foamy wake of our descent. In our frantic effort to undercut the attack, U-557 nosed down toward the ocean floor at a sharp angle, but her stern still hung dangerously close to the surface. The escort's swishing propellers came menacingly closer. Every man looked upward in expectation of the inevitable. Then came a terrific explosion. A giant force lifted U-557 by the stern and shook her violently, slamming the crew to the floor plates and throwing the boat into darkness. A second detonation burst moments later. Low, rolling thunder followed. Fader shouted, "By emergency lighting, blow tank 3 and 5, both planes up." Some lights flickered. The impact of the well-placed spread had forced the boat down to 185 meters, but the chief had kept her well under control. It was the fastest dive he had ever made. Paulson ordered silence. He spoke in a low voice, almost whispering. "Rig for silent running. Port motor 70 revolutions. Starboard 60. All auxiliary motors were stopped. All instruments not needed were shut off. U-557 floated at an incredible depth, noiselessly. Came the report from the soundman. Target in 120, second target in 225. We did not need the sound operator to tell us what was happening on the surface. ASDIC pings hit our hull like arrows. The destroyers above us set themselves up for a new barrage. We heard their pumps and their auxiliary motors. We even heard someone drop a hammer accidentally. For a moment, all 3 hunters stopped. Then one destroyer started her turbine, threw her propellers into high gear, and began her run. The swishing noise was accompanied by high-pitched ASDIC impulses that penetrated the steel plates and hit every man's heart. As the destroyer crossed over our boat, we heard 1, 2, 3 distinct splashes depth charges, 3 deafening explosions astern to our port. The boat moaned under the impact, then shook off the salvos with a violent motion. At once a second pursuer began her assault. "Both full ahead together!" yelled the captain. "Hold your breath, sailors!" 3 more abominable detonations. U-557 trembled, deck plates jumped, air hissed, but the boat remained watertight. The latest spread had exploded astern to starboard. It seemed that the hunters had no clear picture of our position. High seas and our extreme depth had saved us. U-557 slowly floated away, leaving the destroyers far astern. For 3 hours we kept up our silent running, and the destroyers continued exploding their charges. Then Paulson reckoned we had put a safe distance of 5,000 meters between us and the hunters. At 5 o'clock, U-557 surfaced. Fresh air streamed into the hull. The night was still black. We proceeded eastward with 1 diesel full ahead, while the other recharged our exhausted batteries. The regular watch took over. We had escaped the hunter-killer group and resumed our pursuit of the vanished convoy. Shortly after dawn, May 27th, our radio operator received an urgent directive from U-boat headquarters. Emergency all U-boats with torpedoes to proceed at once and at full speed toward Bismarck Grid Square, B-29. Paulson was given the decoded message on the bridge at 6:30. By then, the order was some 8 hours old. It had first been issued at 21 o'clock the previous evening, while we were submerged and unable to receive it. Since we had been under attack most of the night, we had no information on Bismarck's predicament. but we guessed that the battleship must have crashed into a superior enemy force after her companion ship, Prince Eugen, had been dismissed. Paulson was on the spot. Should he continue to chase the convoy or hurry to help the big ship? Bismarck's position was more than 350 miles southeast of U-557, too far to be reached that day. While Paulson worked toward a decision, we intercepted a signal from U-556. The message said that the Bismarck was engaged in a losing battle. This forced the captain to turn immediately toward the Bismarck's last reported position. We did not realize it at the time, but as U-557 raced southward, 2 enemy battleships, 1 carrier, 2 cruisers, and a number of destroyers had converged on the distant battlefield and were delivering the coup de grace to the mightiest man of war afloat. The ocean went high, the wind swept hard. Showers cut into our faces. At 9 o'clock we sighted 2 escorts and had to make a half-hour detour to avoid them. But when we returned to our previous course, our mission had already become obsolete. At 11 o'clock we received from headquarters this sad message: Bismarck victim of concentrated enemy fire. All U-boats in vicinity to search for survivors. All night and the next morning we raced southeast through quieting seas toward Grid Square B65, where the Bismarck had fought her last battle. We arrived over her grave at noon on May 29th, 2 days and 7 hours too late. The water was calm and covered with a heavy layer of oil and debris. While the regular watch surveyed sea and sky for the enemy, a few of us scanned the flotsam for survivors. We found none, not a corpse, not a single raft or life preserver. We searched the area for a full day, then turned back toward the northern convoy routes. Our short mission had thus proved quite successful. Boat and crew had emerged from their baptismal fire with colours flying, and with torpedoes left over for another attack. After a day's westward sail of almost 200 miles, we removed the 2 torpedoes from our outboard pressure tubes and lowered them into the hull. That afternoon we received from headquarters a new order. Proceed at once into AK-50, HX convoy expected. Anticipated speed 9 knots, course east-northeast. At once Paulson swung U-557 around in a lazy sea. Spring had returned to the North Atlantic. For the first time since our departure, we enjoyed being on the bridge. Bearded, pale-faced machinists stole a few minutes to look at the sun and the sky, to fill their lungs with clean, fresh air. Inside, the boat conditions were quite different. The stench of 51 sweating seamen, diesel oil, rotting food, and mouldy bread mingled with the noisome odours that emanated from the galley and the 2 tiny washrooms. The overbearing smells and the never-ending rocking made the men in the narrow drum dizzy and numb. Only the daily trim dive brought partial relief from the perpetual swaying. On our march back into the northern region, not a single ship crossed our track, but Paulson was far from relaxing the rules. In fact, he made it a matter of routine to plunge his boat into a crash dive for exercise at the least expected moment when all was calm in the boat. He gave his deputies Exec Kern as torpedo and gunnery officer, Seibold as radio officer, Feder as chief, and Wiesner as navigator a tight schedule of lessons designed to make us 3 ensigns good submariners before we returned to port. We were already employed to capacity. We mounted our 4-hour watches every 8 hours, Gerloff taking the first, Goebel the second, and I the third watch. We serviced the torpedoes, took turns in the diesel and motor rooms, crawled into the narrow battery compartments to control the acid level and to test the air for possible escaped gases, relieved the mates in the control room, and made calculations to establish our position from bearings taken whenever the horizon was clear at dawn or dusk. Nevertheless, despite this workload, Paulson himself gave us instructions on diving and attack procedures at any hour of day or night as he saw fit. Concerned that we might not meet his high standards, we regularly swung ourselves into our bunks with an engineering manual and studied until overpowered by fatigue. The headlamps were still burning when we were awakened for a turn on the bridge. As a result, we never opened those books we had purchased in Kiel for our anticipated leisure hours. After a journey of several days, we arrived in our assigned grid square. Visibility was excellent, but neither binoculars nor listening equipment disclosed an enemy ship. we spent a frustrating week crisscrossing the area in various search patterns. Then Paulson informed headquarters of his findings or lack of findings. It was an afternoon in early June when we were ordered into another square. According to intelligence reports, a convoy had assembled before Halifax Harbour, and its path was to bring it into an area 600 miles south of Greenland. U-557 set out to intercept. We made an unexpected contact the following day. I had just finished lunch and was smoking a cigarette on deck when the port lookout pointed forward and called, "Mast ahead, bearing 350. It was then 12 o'clock. The exec swung the boat around and called for Paulson. When U-557 completed her turn, the target was located astern, its masts sticking up like toothpicks in the distance. Paulson hastened on the bridge to discover that the target, steering a westerly course, was about to disappear below the horizon. The captain cursed angrily and yelled into the hatch, "Right full rudder, both engines emergency ahead." This was the signal. The hunt had begun. Our sleek boat split the choppy surface, leaving a foamy wake. After 15 minutes, we determined that we had a large freighter before our tubes. Kern sent a constant stream of information into the conning tower, allowing Wiesner to plot the enemy's course and speed. Constant bearings established the fact that we had a slight speed advantage over the vessel. Paulson raced his boat just behind the horizon, at the limit of visibility, attempting to get ahead of the target for a submerged attack. Suddenly, the ship made an abrupt change of course. Her 3 masts melted into one and sank into the sea. For 20 minutes it was touch and go, but she crept back over the sharp blue horizon in the south, then turned to display her masts and funnel. Soon thereafter, at 14 o'clock, Wiesner climbed onto the bridge and presented his chart to the captain. "Sir, the target zigzags clearly around a mean course of 260 degrees, speed 14 knots. Paulson was satisfied. The two plotted the attack and determined the course that would intersect the freighter's track. We took a coffee break while the doomed freighter hastened to a rendezvous with her executioner. At 16 o'clock, the captain changed course to cross the target's path. U-557 reduced her speed momentarily and turned east toward the zigzagging ship. We proceeded slowly under a very blue sky, carefully scanning the sea. First we saw a smoke puff, then recognized the mastheads. "Alarm!" The dive went like clockwork. The soundman reported, "Propeller noise in 00, getting louder fast." Paulson, swinging himself onto the seat of the scope in the tower, gave his order. "Prepare tubes 3 and 4 for firing fanshot." He took a sweep all around the boat, then advised, "No more reports, I have her well covered. Rudder left 10, right so, steer 70. Attention computer, target speed 16, angle left 25, depth 8. Using these values, the computer worked out the exact gyro angle, transmitting it simultaneously to each of the torpedoes in the tubes. The periscope motor hummed continually. Paulson manoeuvred into attack position, held the boat steady, reduced her speed, then rapped out his final orders. Correct distance 800, angle left 30, tubes 3 and 4 ready fire. 2 light shocks indicated that both torpedoes had left their tubes. A swishing sound came from the bow compartment, accompanied by an increase in air pressure. The compressed air, which had activated the large pin locks that expelled the torpedoes, was released into the boat instead of the water, thus avoiding the bubbly swell on the surface that had revealed the position of submerged U-boats during World War I. Meanwhile, the torpedoes, examples of a new type powered by batteries, followed their fixed course toward the doomed ship without producing the sparkling streaks of older, faster models, propelled by compressed air, which were reserved for use in night attacks. The 2 steel fish and the British ship headed steadily toward their intersection. 2 powerful detonations from the freighter rocked our boat. "She's hit! She's sinking!" shouted Paulson. He leaned back, allowing the exec to take a quick look. The second mate was the next to witness the kill. I followed and was struck with amazement. The vessel was sinking on even keel. There was no fire on board. Her superstructure was painted brilliant yellow, her hull fire engine red. A beautiful ship. She had settled with her deck about 1 meter above water, and she showed no inclination to sink further. The freighter's crew was a band owning ship. Since the sea was calm, disembarking went without panic. As the lifeboats left the vessel, Paulson sailed among them, training his scope on the stunned men. Again he let me take a look. In one of the rafts, the freighter's captain waved his white cap at his dying ship. Paulson decided that it was necessary to administer a coup de grace. He sailed clear of the lifeboats, pointed our bow toward the stricken ship, and released another torpedo. It took 32 seconds to hit. With a long, hollow explosion, the proud vessel went down to the ocean floor. 30 minutes after sundown, we surfaced. In 3 hours, we had put 9 miles between our boat and the rafts. To ensure rescue of the survivors, we released a standard SOS signal on the 600-meter international wavelength. Minutes later, Paulson transmitted the following radio message to Admiral U-boats. Sunk 5, total 30,000. Only 5 torpedoes. Low on fuel, U-557. Travelling at high speed for 2 days, U-557 took up the assigned position in Grid Square AJ-94. On our arrival, heavy fog was rolling in. It reduced our chances to spot the convoy. At times, the milky fog banks were so dense we could not even see our own bow or stern from the bridge. We dived often for a sound check, but in order to survey our large area, we had to cover great distances between our dives. These dangerous dashes reduced our fuel supply to such a point we could not attack the convoy and return to base without refueling. Paulson put through another message to headquarters, explaining the urgent need for supply. We waited 6 hours for the answer. It instructed us to proceed to a location approximately 80 miles off the southernmost tip of Greenland and refuel from the German tanker Belchen, which had eluded British raiders since the beginning of the war. We turned our boat around and chased with both engines full ahead toward the rendezvous. The weather grew rapidly colder, and we slipped into our blue knitted underwear. 2 days on this course took us into the iceberg region. We changed course often to skirt the small icebergs. Soon immense bergs appeared, and we sailed a respectful distance from these mountains. No one aboard had seen such a spectacle, so the captain permitted the crew to observe the scenery. Between the azure sky and the light green ocean, hundreds of icebergs, splendidly white and of all sizes, floated majestically southbound. The sun reflected 1,000,000-fold in the glassy surfaces of these swimming islands. "Smoke clouds on port!" yelled a lookout. He had sighted 3 grey vessels warships of a large class and of unknown nationality. "Alarm!" We jumped into the hatch and U-557 left the surface in a rapid fall. Feder balanced the boat, then brought her up to periscope depth, but Paulson's view of the ships was blocked by the menacing icebergs. He frantically rotated the scope in his search for the enemy and his attempt to avoid hitting the submerged portion of the mountains, then finally caught sight of the 3 ships. He identified them as British cruisers of the London class. Focusing the scope on the targets, he ordered all tubes made ready for firing. He corrected his findings and changed course several times, then waited for the 1 second when all values would be in perfect coordination. But that second never came. The targets changed course abruptly and steamed away at 24 knots, far in excess of our top speed. Paulson shook his head in dismay. After a short waiting period, we surfaced and set a new course to meet with the tanker. The icebergs gradually diminished as we sailed closer to Greenland's southwest coast. Early on the 3rd day after our encounter with the British cruisers, we found the Lonely Belch on at the designated place. Approaching slowly, we identified ourselves, exchanged courtesies through the megaphone, and caught the line to which the oil hose was fastened. Paulson manoeuvred U-557 into the near-invisible wake of the tanker. She was a low, long ship of approximately 15,000 tons, and probably carried enough fuel to supply our boats for months or even a year. One of our machinists attached the hose to an outboard valve and secured the rope on deck. Then U-557 began to suck the much-needed oil into her empty tanks. Foodstuff was shuttled from Belchen by rubber boats. At noon we received company. Another U-boat had found her way to the supply ship and made her fueling connection with the tanker. At 15 o'clock the assembly grew to 3 U-boats. U-93, with Korth in command, arrived and stood by at some distance in the icy waters. It was a rare and strange congregation, 4 German vessels in a lost corner of the North Atlantic. Pleasantries circulated from boat to boat, and also our warning of the 3 British cruisers. At 17 o'clock we removed the hose, transferred it aboard U-93, wished each other good hunting, and separated from the group. U-557 took on a southwesterly course, running at high speed toward an evening sky. 4 hours later, during a dive to trim the boat, we heard 3 hollow detonations far astern. A whole series of booms followed. The bombardment lasted 10 minutes. It came from the exact position of the Belchen. We were certain that the British cruisers had finally located their target. At 23 o'clock, U-557 surfaced, made radio contact with Admiral U-boats, reported refueling accomplished, and the probable fate of Belchen. Sometime between midnight and dawn, our radio operator intercepted a confirming message. Belchen with captain sunk by British surface warships. Rescued crew, fueling not completed, returned to base with 93 men, U-93. We proceeded toward Grid Square BB-90 to operate on the convoy route between Halifax and St. John. S. Passing through the area where the icy Labrador Current meets the warm Gulf Stream, we were enveloped in heavy fog, but the curtain rose the moment we crossed the 47th parallel. The radiant sunshine surprised us after several days of blindness. The sea was choppy, but the air was mild. We slowly patrolled the routes for 2 days, with only 1 diesel working at a time. It was mid-June, and the summer season was about to reach its peak. On each watch, my thoughts wandered back across the Atlantic, some 3,500 miles east, to where Marianne was awaiting some sign of my safe return. I recalled for the 100th time our last tête-à-tête and dreamed about a Wiedersehen on the beaches of the Wannsee in Berlin. Love and life seemed so long ago, so far away, almost unreal. At 16 o'clock on one of those flawlessly sunny days, I was released from my watch after sitting on the rim of the bridge for hours, skimming the horizon. I went below and had a sandwich garnished with rancid butter and green mould. I sweetened it with a heavy portion of strawberry jam and washed it down with strong coffee. But at 18 o'clock the meal ended abruptly. A cry arose from the bridge, electrifying, blood-curdling. "Both full ahead, right full rudder, torpedoes on starboard." I leapt through the control room and up the tower. Reaching the bridge as the diesels began to howl, I spotted 3 sparkling streaks rushing toward us with insane accuracy. The horrifying sight of death coming closer paralyzed us. During those very last seconds, I braced myself to meet eternity. In a moment, the foamy streaks would hit the boat. Now. Now. But there was no detonation, not even the sound of steel hitting steel. Astonishment at our survival overcame us. As we spun around to portside, the ghostly wakes of the torpedoes revealed to us that 2 of them had underpassed U-557 midships, and 1 had shot by the rudder astern. Still not quite sure that we were alive, we inhaled deeply, and our hearts began to beat again. U-557, in agonizing sluggishness, had finally turned to starboard and achieved greater speed. Ahead of us was the launching point of the enemy's torpedoes, a swell clearly visible on the choppy surface. Within moments we reached the spot. Paulson, who mounted the bridge only seconds after death had brushed us, shouted out determined orders. "Battle stations, clear the bridge!" The crew eagerly prepared for a duel between U-boat and submarine. The alarm shrieked, and U-557 plunged after her attacker into the black depth. The captain ordered all tubes flooded and made himself comfortable in the control room, where he could concentrate on both the sound gear and the torpedo computer. This was a different kind of fighting. Our boat sailed in almost total soundlessness. Our listening gear located the enemy sub in a westerly direction, but as soon as we had her dead ahead, her propellers swishing gradually diminished. The enemy was on the run. We chased her with all our power, but to no avail. The enemy submarine was faster. Paulson became suspicious. "I'll bet that sub is going to surface. Chief, prepare for surfacing. Have diesels ready for immediate high speed." I followed the captain into the tower. The soundman's voice came through the tube. "Enemy blows all tanks." Paulson countered. Surface blowout tanks with both diesels full ahead. Moments later, the boat cleared the water, and we stormed to the bridge with our glasses trained dead ahead. There she was, no more than 8,000 meters before our tubes. With 3 times full ahead, we chased the sub. Her fuming diesels made it obvious that she, too, was under full power to avoid our counterattack. She began to zigzag. Her erratic dashes gave us views of her superstructure to compare with diagrams in the International Naval Catalogue. Paulson and Kern discovered that she was a British submarine of the Thames class. We realised that the British submarine was our superior in size and speed. Since it was fruitless to chase her, we changed course and followed the attacker with our glasses until she disappeared behind the horizon in the direction of Boston. We wondered what the British skipper would say for failing to sink us with 3 torpedoes. He had made a perfect approach and had made an excellent fan shot. 2 torpedoes out of 3 would have been hits if the torpedoes had been set to run at proper depth. Whatever caused the failure, it had saved the lives of 51 men. At sunset and 25 miles later, the captain ordered U-557 below surface to celebrate the survival of the entire crew. We called it a birthday party. The same night, after resurfacing, we informed headquarters. Have been attacked by British submarine in CC-36. Counter-attack. Enemy escaped. U-557. We remained in the general area for another 5 days. The sneak attack prompted us to keep watch for periscopes as well as smokestacks. We saw neither. For the second time in a short period, we had been ordered into a specific square to attack a convoy which was not there. The possibility of a leak in our security system occurred to some of us. Following orders from headquarters, we headed for Grid Square BC-35. Here, together with 2 companion U-boats, we were to form an advanced patrol line that ran from the 48th to the 53rd parallel, passing some 450 miles east of Newfoundland. We arrived 2 days later. By now, 6 weeks had passed since we had left port. We had become full-fledged submariners. However, our food supply, which was calculated to last for 2 months, had shrunk considerably despite the few cans we had received from Belchen. Much had landed in the bilges or had turned bad. Paulson quickly solved the problem. He ordered Seybold to reduce the daily ration. As a result, we tightened our belts every other day. On the morning of June 20th, we intercepted a radio signal from Commander Mutzelberg, whose U-boat was also hunting in the northern Atlantic. Have sighted us Battleship Texas in blockade area. Ask permission to shoot. U-203. The appearance of the Texas was a remarkable challenge by the Americans, who knew that every foreign ship that entered our blockade area was risking destruction. What would be Dönitz's decision? We were all for shooting and sinking the Texas. U-203, still without an answer that afternoon, asked again for permission to attack. At dusk, we finally intercepted and deciphered an important signal from Admiral U-boats, replying to Mutzelberg's pressing demands. By order of the Führer, all incidents with United States ships must be avoided in the coming weeks. Until further notice, attacks may not be made on battleships, cruisers and aircraft carriers, unless definitely identified as hostile. Warships steaming at night without lights are not necessarily hostile. This order not only denied U-203 the right to shoot, it was also eventually directed to all U-boats at sea, and significantly limited our future method of operation, especially on guarded convoys. As we would learn, it was virtually impossible at night to distinguish a British destroyer from a US escort. On June 22nd, the broadcast of the latest Armed Forces communiqué rocked our boat like a depth-charge barrage. Our armies were on the attack against the Soviet Union, advancing from the Baltic to the Black Sea. This event caused great excitement on board. Our invasion of Russia, which dwarfed Napoleon's attempt in scale and scope, represented a basic and long-awaited German aspiration. We had been taught that there was no possibility of Germany living side by side with the Soviet Union. Communism, not England and her Western allies, was Germany's mortal enemy. As everyone knew, the non-aggression pact we had signed with Stalin in August 1939 was but a temporary measure, a clever delaying tactic. Now that our eastern armies were on the march, the fall of Russia could be expected soon, and our thousand-year Reich would be assured. We had been in Grid Square BC 35 for a number of days without success. Then at dawn of June 23rd, we received a long-awaited radio message. Convoy in BD 15 on course east 10 knots. All U-boats in vicinity to operate on target with highest speed. Immediately we calculated our chances. They were excellent. U-557 began pursuit. It developed into a tense and thrilling hunt. We ploughed southeast at 18 knots to intercept the convoy in about 22 hours. The day passed and night promised a new encounter. The sky was dark, the air was crisp, the sea choppy and black. A perfect night for a surprise attack. But not a single shadow appeared. When day dawned, we saw nothing but an endless stretch of sea. According to our fix, we should have met with the convoy 4 hours before. Not knowing in which direction to search, we ran huge zigzags on an easterly course, trying to see beyond the sharp line of the horizon. At 9 o'clock, we received new instructions from headquarters. First U-boat making contact with convoy must report all pertinent information before attack. We were also advised that 4 other boats were heading toward the convoy. With eyes strained, we scurried eastward for the entire day without seeing a smudge in the sky. It was as though the convoy had never existed. The high-speed run reduced our fuel supply sharply, and we knew we would not be able to go west again. At 21 o'clock, a scream came through the hatch. "Captain to the bridge! Shadows ahead!" Paulson, wearing sunglasses to protect his eyes from the lights in the hull, and thus be ready for a nighttime emergency, raced tip the ladder onto the bridge. Moments later, I heard his call. "Battle stations, prepare for surface attack." I bounded into position behind the captain and realized that we had crashed into the rear of the convoy. The first thing I saw was a destroyer on parallel course, a faint shadow only. Paulson outmaneuvered the threat, leaving her starboard astern. Visibility was but 3,000 meters. We clung to the fringes of the convoy only until the captain had determined all target values. Seabold radioed our findings to base. Then U-557 surged ahead into attack position. 2 giant shadows mounted on port. Another Phantom appeared starboard ahead, mean distance only 600 meters. The vessels on port overlapped each other, excellent targets. Paulson screamed a few commands. U-557 slowed down. 8-9 shadows lumbered closer through the long breakers. The captain ordered Kern to shoot. At that moment I spotted a destroyer. No, 2 destroyers cutting through the curtain of darkness astern, angle 0. I waited for Kern to shoot until I could no longer contain myself. Then I shouted, "2 destroyers in attack position." Paulson swung around and faced the menace. "Holy Cross, exec, shoot!" From Kern. "Tube 1 and 2, fire. Tube 4, fire. Close tube doors, both 3 times full ahead." The captain yelled into the wind. U-557 gained momentum only slowly. As our torpedoes sliced toward the masses of steel, we slipped into the deadly grip of the 2 escorts. A hard detonation to our left. A second boom followed. I saw one of the shadows explode into 2 fire columns, and the ship ceased to exist. There was no third hit. Star shells and parachute flares drenched our boat in daylight. We saw we were trapped. The 2 hunters were closing in astern. A third raced up amidship from behind a freighter. There was no escape on surface. We were squeezed between a giant press. "Alarm!" The captain's call was drowned in the shriek of the bell. U-557 dipped her bow into the inky sea. Simultaneously, a thunderous explosion lifted the boat by the stern, shook her violently, and turned her wildly off her axis. U-557 was out of control. She fell fast. "Leak in diesel compartment. Starboard motor out of order. Rudder jammed." 4 hellish eruptions threw the boat around like a toy, forced her deeper into depth, made her sway and tumble. Men skidded along the deck plates. In the flicker of emergency lighting, I saw the needle of the depth gauge waver at the 125-meter mark, then move rapidly to 140, 160, 180 meters. The thrashing sound of a destroyer came nearer, and the footsteps of its racing screws seemed to drum loudly against the steel of our hull. All eyes looked upward. The swishing of propellers reached a crescendo as the destroyer passed over our boat. "Rudder harder starboard," shouted Paulson. Port motor half ahead. 3 charges exploded, seemingly just above the conning tower. After each shattering roar, the hull moaned. The floor plates jumped and kicked our feet. Wood splintered, glass disintegrated, food cans flew through the boat. Then all was black for long seconds until the emergency lighting came on again. But the hull itself held tight. Only the gaskets and the seats of many valves had loosened, letting water trickle into the bilges in countless little streams. The force of the detonations had pressed the boat deeper, and the influx of water drove her still closer to the limit of her design. The escorts grouped for another attack, their ASDIC chirping relentlessly. The minutes stretched into endless agony. We hardly risked breathing. Suddenly 2 distinct explosions came from the direction into which we had heard the convoy disappear. Other U-boats had arrived, but elation gave way to horror as the 3 escorts rapidly neared our position. One by one they churned over our coffin, each dropping a final depth charge like chrysanthemums upon our grave. The 3 fiendish bursts only deafened our ears, for U-557 was now too deep for charges to damage her. Only depth itself could have collapsed her hull. 2 hours later we surfaced, shaken and exhausted. The fresh air speedily revived the crew, then we inspected the damages. They were greater than we first assumed. The starboard motor was knocked off its foundation, the aft ballast tank was ruptured, and the starboard shaft was bent. This meant the end of our patrol. U-557 began to crawl 1,600 miles to her new home base, Lorient in western France. The spirit of the crew had been catapulted to the highest peak by our latest success. We did not mind the scars our boat had received. The 37,000 tons of British shipping we had sunk was a vital contribution toward the defeat of Great Britain. This is part 2 of the Memoirs of a German U-boat commander. The continuation of this story will be posted soon. I kindly ask you to subscribe to this channel because your support motivates me to create more videos featuring the valuable memories of soldiers that deserve to be heard. When we reach 10,000 subscribers, I will release a special video as a token of appreciation for your support. Feel free to share your thoughts, memories, or opinions on this story in the comments section.